We'll continue this theme with our third presentation by Dr. J.B. Haws. Dr. Haws is an assistant professor in the Department of Church History and Doctrine here at BYU. He has a PhD in American History from the University of Utah. He's the author of The Mormon Image of the American Mind, 50 Years of Public Perception. He is interested in the history of LDS engagement in interfaith dialogue, as well as the recent history of Mormon history and American studies in that field. He and his wife, Laura, have three sons and a daughter, all thoroughly immersed, he assures us, in BYU Cougar Mania, despite his University of Utah education. He's a native of that ever-popular destination city, Hooper, Utah, and he's now happy to call Provo his home. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Haws.
Well, thanks to Ken for that introduction, and I'm very grateful to be part of this panel. Such thoughtful papers to start. I grew up, as Ken mentioned, in one of those small towns that befuddles newcomers with all kinds of pronunciation peculiarities. It's Hooper, Utah, not Hooper, Utah. We'll see. There we go. We could tell people, you look in a book and find Hooper. You don't look in a book and find Hooper. This is my kind of map right here. Hooper thus becomes the shibboleth of Weber County. You could always detect who wasn't native if they got it wrong. So Ken revealed himself a native Ogdenite because he said it just beautifully. Today I feel something of that same apprehension. I feel very much like a newcomer in approaching a complex historical episode, and I worry about getting it wrong. Not so much in the mispronunciation of beautiful Ghanaian names, although there certainly will be some of that, but in telling the story in a way that locals will recognize as capturing all of the complexities of their experience. But that is one of the great services of history, to depict just how complex the past always is. And so with trepidation, that's the direction we'll be headed. In the middle of June 1989, the government of Ghana suspended all activities of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in that nation. While there had been rumblings of trouble in the months previous to the suspension, nearly all Ghanaian Mormons only found out about the freeze when it was announced on the radio. The suspension was as severe as it was sudden. Military and paramilitary groups occupied the church's buildings and farm. All LDS church meetings were discontinued. Foreign church missionaries and leaders were forced to leave the country, and they were given just 1 week to do so. The future was uncertain, to say the least. After 18 months of tight restrictions, the suspension was lifted. Ironically, in the years following the freeze, the LDS church in Ghana grew as never before. A noteworthy side effect of the government's action against the Latter-day Saints was that the church received unprecedented attention in that country. The government inquiries into Mormon activities and beliefs fueled widespread interest when the full church activities resumed. It is a fantastic story, a story of intrigue. The CIA, or at least the specter of the CIA, played a role, of tension, of diplomacy, of patience, of perseverance, and it is a story that has been told really well in other places. I have to give a nod to Elder Emmanuel Kesey, we'll go one more, and his book, Walking in the Sand, as well as to those who have recorded and analyzed a number of oral histories with Ghanaian Latter-day Saints, Professor Della Barron, Matthew Heiss, former mission president and temple president in Ghana, John Writing, to name a few. I'm indebted to their work. What this presentation hopes to do, though, is to take bearings from an analogy that Melissa Inouye recently presented to the Mormon History Association and then published in the New Mormon Studies Review. Her analogy centers on the banyan tree. Unlike with an oak tree, whose branches all grow from one central trunk, the banyan tree's branches send down prop roots that become, in a sense, trunks in their own right, roots that become indistinguishable from the central trunk. Inouye proposed that this is a way to think about the history of the LDS Church in various locales around the world, where the central trunk and prop root are both nourishing the tree, growth of the tree. In this case, Inouye's analogy, at the very least, calls for a clearer understanding about what was happening on the ground in Ghana, a clear understanding of what the soil was like into which this specific prop root planted itself and drew out nutrients and strength. A view from that ground level raises some questions. What was it about the LDS Church in Ghana, and specifically the Ghana of 1989, that aroused suspicion? What was like during the freeze for Ghanaian Mormons? Mormons like a newly married branch clerk, or a lady missionary whose service was cut short by the freeze, or by a pioneering saint who continued her work on translation of the scriptures? And what changed during and after the freeze? All of this and more was part of the mix, and these are the questions that we'll consider in turn here. Ghana stands out in African history, the first African colony to achieve independence from its European colonizers. Independence came in 1957, but stability did not. By the 1980s, 3 republic governments had come and gone, each one terminated by a military coup of some kind. By the 1980s, the most recent such transition had been the shortest lived. Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings a junior military office, led in 1979 what has been called the mutiny against his military superiors who were then running the country. Rawlings' group then turned governmental control to elected officials. This was the Third Republic. But only 2 years later, Rawlings and his Provisional National Defense Council, the PNDC, as an acronym we'll use often, had retaken control from the Republican government because of widely reported accusations of corruption and mismanagement. Rawlings announced to the nation that this was not a coup, but a revolution, a chance to change the status quo in Ghanaian government. He spoke about giving the people the chance to govern by wresting control from the old establishment of Ghanaian upper class. It almost goes without saying that moves like this unsettled traditional power structures in Ghana, and a number of Ghanaian conservatives, the PNDC might say, the establishment, saw the PNDC as modeling itself after communist regimes, although one commentator noted those assumptions were simplistic and misguided. Still, already by 1984, there were repeated assertions by PNDC officials that the CIA sought to oust the revolutionary government and reinstate the old political elite that the PNDC had displaced. What might have seemed only to be propaganda-type conspiracy theories instead found credibility in coup attempts that originated in neighboring Togo and the Ivory Coast. Then in 1985, an American operative named Sharon Scranage leaked information about the CIA network to her Ghanaian boyfriend, himself an intelligence operative in Ghana and cousin to PNDC head Jerry Rawlings. This boyfriend, Mike Susudis, was arrested by U.S. officials when he visited Scranage in the United States, and he was later only released as part of a prisoner exchange. This web of intrigue and repeated talk of a revolutionary government threw fuel on global fires that created heat, paradoxically, in this Cold War world. Feeling as it did the threat of outside interference, the PNDC government also sought to curb internal dissent. It is worth noting that in 1987, in response to student protests about the PNDC, Rawlings' administration completely closed 3 prominent college campuses. Ironically, student groups had been among the most vocal in opposing the government that preceded the PNDC and had also encouraged Jerry Rawlings' purge. By the mid-1980s, it was widely understood in Ghana that for all intents and purposes, an independent press had ceased to exist. In March 1989, only 3 months before the freeze on the LDS Church, the government revoked the licenses of all publications and required their editors to reapply for registration. The ostensible reason for the re-registration was to protect moral standards and to restore basic standards of decency in journalism and to conserve scarce paper needed for educational publications. Critics, however, noted that the assertions of these kinds of controls undeniably seemed to aim at silencing the opposition. One such prominent spokesman for the opposition, Professor Albert Abu Bohin, put it this way in February 1988, 1 year before the freeze. We have not protested or staged riots, not because we trust the PNDC, but because we fear the PNDC. We are afraid of being detained, liquidated, or dragged before the CVC or NIC or being subjected to all sorts of molestation. And in any case, have Ghanaians not been protesting as the head of state thinks? They have been, in a very subtle and quiet way, hence the culture of silence. At the same time, this picture of an overly totalitarian regime calls for some nuance. It should be noted that the Rawlings government seemed sincere in its self-perception that it was warring against endemic corruption. The availability and reliability of civil services in Ghana did improve during the 1980s. And importantly, when the PNDC did give way to the Fourth Republic and open elections in 1992, Jerry Rawlings won the majority vote for president, and he was reelected in 1996. This says something about a public divided in its appraisal of PNDC efforts. Plus, it seems safe to say that for most in this audience, it would be difficult to understand the shadow of imperialism that Ghanaians still felt keenly in the 1980s, being as they were only one generation removed from their declared independence. Centuries of exploitation created psychic wounds that were still understandably raw in the 1980s. In that climate, Mormons, especially the American Mormon missionaries, seemed doubly suspicious, and sometimes simple mistakes exacerbated those suspicions. Ghanaian church member William Sower remembered one incident where 2 American Mormon missionaries were disoriented as they drove around the city and inadvertently drove their car toward the heavily restricted government castle. When they realized their mistake, they made a quick U-turn, but that only caused the soldiers who watched the U-turn to rush to detain the missionaries for questioning. It took the intervention of church officials to secure the missionaries' release. Who knows, a Ghanaian newspaper asked in December 1986, whether Latter-day Saints are an offshoot of the CIA. By the time of the freeze, Mormons had 2 decades of history in Ghana, even though the church had only been in the country officially for 1 decade, as Clint so well documented. Pioneers like Joseph W.B. Billy Johnson had organized hundreds of believers, even before missionaries arrived in 1978 on the hills of the Revelation, extending the priesthood to all worthy males and temple blessings to all worthy saints. Billy Johnson's pre-1978 success was a foretaste of the growth that would come after 1978. In its first official decade, missionaries baptized 8,500 converts, organized in 6 districts, 48 branches. But apart from numeric growth, there were other signs of Mormon success. Mormons were securing properties for buildings. Mormon missionaries drove cars, a sure sign of affluence, and this was repeatedly noted. The religious terrain of 1980s Ghana was undergoing some plate tectonic shifts as well. New churches were popping up everywhere. Enthusiastic converts were leaving more traditional and long-tenured denomination and flocking to these new groups. Dr. Bennett's paper in that vein. In that, the Mormons were only one of many of these new religious groups. This membership movement was not lost on the mainline churches of Ghana's Christian Council, who raised their defenses too, and at least with Mormonism, they found potent ammunition for a counterattack. It might be appropriate at this point to turn back to what was happening contemporaneously in the United States in terms of public opinion about Mormonism. In 1977, Gallup found that 54% of surveyed Americans rated Mormons favorably, a public opinion high point for some years. This survey came right in the middle of the LDS Church's hugely successful Homefront media campaign, where memorable public service ads about family togetherness forever linked Mormonism and family friendliness in the public's mind. However, in 1991, 14 years after the Gallup poll just mentioned, the Barna Group asked a similar question of American respondents. This time around, though, only 27% saw Mormons favorably. The decrease was dramatic, cut in half in just over a decade. At the very least, this polling data suggests that Mormonism's public reputation took a serious hit in the 1980s. One of the significant blows in that decade came in the form of a movie called The Godmakers. This movie, spearheaded by former Mormon Ed Decker and his Saints Alive in Jesus, painted the LDS Church in ominous, even satanic hues. The movie connected Mormonism with suicide and forced family breakups, and lumped the church's theology and temple rites with paganism and the occult. The movie's producers said the movie was being shown to 1,000 groups, often church groups, and 250,000 viewers a month in 1983 and 84. With that kind of potency, Saints Alive, or Ex-Mormons for Jesus, took the film abroad. The film and its purveyors first created a stir in Israel, where BYU was building the Jerusalem Center. Then Ed Decker's group and its pamphlets and film played a significant role in the Ghana Freeze. Latter-day Saints in Ghana at the time felt that both government and religious leaders who were suspicious, and perhaps grudging, of Mormon growth were all too receptive when these anti-Mormon materials made their way into Ghanaian hands. The two most damning of the claims that Saints Alive leveled against Latter-day Saints were these. First, that Mormons carried out bizarre rituals in their temples, including, according to one supposed witness whose testimony was published in a Ghanaian newspaper, the ceremonial washing of initiates in the bodily fluids of corpses. It should be noted that Emmanuel Kisi emphatically wrote that no Ghanaian church member by the name of the article's author was ever found. The Godmakers, with its reenactment of some temple rites, even found a home on national Ghanaian TV, shown twice. Second, Mormonism allegedly positioned blacks as internally inferior to whites. Statements from 19th century LDS leaders about priesthood restrictions or the curse of Cain and the skins of blackness understandably grated on Ghanaian ears. As is the case of government worries with CIA plots seeming more plausible after Mike Sucida's arrest, the charges about Mormon bizarreness took on new believability when a number of new religious movements, not LDS Church, but other movements, proved to be in the business of bilking congregants of their money and their leaders arrested. Suddenly, the reports of media outlets such as these, and in which we've also seen the media working with PNDC approval, carried more weight when they accused new religious movements of having designs on destabilizing Ghana or at least extracting wealth from her citizens. These allegations of Mormon deviance offended Ghanaians on a number of fronts: national sovereignty, patriotism, race, and religion. With all this in the air, it is not difficult to see why some officials turned chilly. And in this light, the freeze seems less arbitrary, less reactionary, and less outrageous than it otherwise might seem. On that same day in June 1989, the government likewise froze the activities and assets of the Jehovah's Witnesses and two smaller homegrown religious sects. These additional targets of sanctions speak to that same public apprehension. After all, Jehovah's Witnesses abstained from signs of national patriotism, a troubling stance in the eyes of a revolutionary government already feeling the dissatisfaction of another of her constituencies. It's worth stating here the obvious. None of this, though, made the freeze any less painful for those who were so deeply affected by it. Here are a few stories to give a sense of what it was like. I'm indebted to Professor Barbara Morgan here at BYU for this recent interview with Jesse Nyankonor Boafo, one of Ghana's first sister missionaries, who was 3 weeks removed from finishing her mission in the home country when the freeze was announced. She and her companion were immediately placed under house arrest by the police in Kumasi as the officers awaited instructions from their superiors in Accra. Although the sister missionaries weren't comfortable with these officers, who were stationed at their living quarters essentially day and night for that week, the close contact with these policemen gave the missionaries opportunities to talk about the gospel message they had been preaching. One by one, Jesse Boafo remembered, they gave away 2 boxes worth of copies of the Book of Mormon to these police officers who were curious about this church that had been singled out by the government, and the officers would tuck the books quietly in their shirts as they left. Finally, word came that the missionaries were to be sent back to their homes. In front of a crowd of people who had gathered to witness their departure, the senior police officer searched the sisters' luggage item by item and showed each item to the crowd. When the officer found Sister Boafo's journal, marked where she had just finished writing about handing the Book of Mormon to the junior officers, he opened it, read about his men's interest, and tore these pages out from her journal, furious. He handed the journal back to her, and her mission came to an end this way. 2 weeks after the sweeping sanctions, Stephen Abu, the church's district president in Abamusu, was outside his home when a military convoy pulled up and ordered him to come with them to the police station. That was not, however, their destination. They ordered President Abu to open the building. As soon as the door was opened, the military men with their rifles rushed in and ransacked all the rooms, looking for evidence, this is in Emmanuel Kesey's words, of subversive activities against the state to justify placing the permanent ban on the church. The only useful thing they could take away, Elder Kesey said, was money that had been locked up in the cabinet. They warned President Abu never to set foot there again, and then the convoy drove to a church welfare farm nearby and auctioned off the church's 300 chickens. They warned President Abu to keep off the farm too. With fortuitous foresight and perhaps sensing, reading the national mood, church leaders on a general and local level had devised an emergency plan in the weeks before the official freeze was imposed. The plan went into effect immediately. Priesthood holders were authorized to administer the sacrament in their own homes. Branch presidents made regular visits to each home. Emmanuel Kesey, the district president in Accra, became the acting mission president of the Ghana Accra mission, and Joseph W.B. Johnson and his wife became silent missionaries, changing their mode of operation from missionary work to strengthening the saints. The saints were very strict about honoring this law, but sometimes even home meetings incurred the displeasure of the authorities. William Soa, we'll go to this. I love this picture of Brother Soa from Scott Proctor in Meridian Magazine. He was a recently married branch clerk at the time of the freeze. When he heard the announcement, he rushed to the branch office to retrieve as many of the church records as he could before the lockdown. And after that, Williams said, the meeting house was taken over by military men. They would sleep there. They would do everything. They would live there like it was their home. Typically, Brother Soa said he had the sacrament meeting at his home, but occasionally would visit and attend sacrament with another member. And on this occasion, he went to the home of, we'll say, Brother Lawrence, we'll change his name, and went there to join in him with the sacrament. On his way to Brother Lawrence's home, he saw on the street a man who had been a less active member even before the freeze. He invited him to join in the sacrament meeting, so they went. When they arrived, Brother Lawrence and his extended family were there, and so Brother Soa, this less active brother, and a neighbor who lived close by who had been even less active than the one that he had met on the street came for this. After the sacrament, Brother Lawrence's sister had a young boy who was ill, and they decided to give him a blessing. As they were in the middle of the blessing, they heard shots fired outside and shouts from military officers who burst in and arrested them for holding a secret meeting. When I asked Brother Soa how they were alerted to their presence, he said that this Brother Lawrence had been a former official in the military before retirement and had created some bad feelings in the neighborhood, and that many of the neighbors felt like this was the chance to get back at him. They dragged these 4 men to jail, including these 2 less active brothers. Brother Soa said, I felt very sorry for them who had been less active long before the freeze. I was okay. I knew that this was one of those things and that we had seen similar things in scriptures. We had seen matters of the faith. I knew that whatever this is, God knows what this is and he is in control. But I was wondering what was going through their mind. When they walked into this group cell where they were thrown, maybe 25 men, the cell captain, the longest tenured prisoner, said, what are you in here for? And they told him they were in a house having a prayer. And he said, since you are pastors, you are going to preach to us this evening. That night, they want us to preach. So we shared, this is in the words of Brother Soa, we shared the story of the restoration of Joseph Smith. We didn't have the Book of Mormon with us, but we shared it, and we asked them to look for the Book of Mormon anytime they came out of the cell, anytime they get the opportunity to read it. And I bore my testimony that I know this is the true church of Jesus Christ, and nothing will shake my faith. Then Brother Lawrence bore his testimony. Then the first less active brother bore his testimony, and the second less active brother bore his testimony. By the time we finished bearing testimony, the place became quiet. It was total quiet. Everybody else drifted to sleep, but we were so quiet, and we had a very blissful night. All the noise ceased. My thought was that they were all probably pondering, and then they fell asleep. The next morning after about 8:30, the officers opened the cell and asked us to come out. This officer was the same national security man who was also a brother of the president and the head of state. It is worth noting at this point that the church member who effected their release was Isaac Addy. He had been the church's manager of temporal affairs in Ghana, and he was the older half-brother of Jerry Rawlings, head of the PNDC. That personal dynamic proved beneficial in a number of cases, but it also put Isaac Addy in an awkward spot of treading carefully, yet he did wield influence quietly. When Kojo Tsikata, Isaac Addy's uncle and head of the National Security Force, told Isaac that he supported the freeze because blacks were limited in what they could do in this church, like attend the sacred temples, Isaac immediately went to his home, collected his temple recommend and his sealing certificate, and brought it back for his uncle to see. In large measure, that story is emblematic of what set the wheels in motion that brought the freeze to an end. In a twist of irony, it was the government's very request that all churches be registered that may have proved to be its undoing. The mainline churches resisted this incursion on religious liberty in what Emmanuel Kisi called them having to swallow the bitter pill that they had sought to administer to others. And because of public opinion with the churches, the government backed off. The key was trying to find a way that the government could relent while still maintaining saving faith. And it seems like that way was discovered when the government announced that it had found these churches fit to be registered, even if they chose not to register. And the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as you can see, was one of the first on that list. The aftermath of this story deserves a better retelling than we have time for today. But I think it's worth noting this one thing. In 1998, when President Gordon B. Hinckley met with Jerry Rawlings, who at this time now was the president of Ghana, Jerry Rawlings was the first to get the news that the church planned to build a temple in Ghana. And his quote, what he said to President Hinckley, is worth noting. President Rawlings said, "I must take back some of the conflicting signals." In the end, conflicting signals seems to strike the right note about the complexity of this time in Ghana. And it speaks to the efforts of so many who worked to clear up those misunderstandings and to help a church emerge from this freeze that was transcending American themes and establishing a new level of trust with both the government and the people of Ghana, and has proven since to be a force for good in that nation. Thank you.